I was going through a private collection of early zoo postcards, the kind sold to tourists in the 1870s, when I noticed something none of the tour guides ever point out. In nearly every photograph, the animal enclosures rest on foundations that look nothing like the century that supposedly built them. Not brick, not mortar, not the rough fieldstone you would expect from a municipal budget in provincial Europe. Instead, block after block of dressed granite and basalt, cut with a precision that modern stonemasons still struggle to match by hand. The animals came later. The platforms were already there. This is not a fringe detail. It is the foundation, literally, of every major zoological garden built in the 19th century. London, Dublin, Budapest, Warsaw, Zurich. Each institution has an official founding date, an official architect, an official budget. None of them have a surviving record of who quarried, transported, and assembled the megalithic bases their enclosures sit on. The paperwork simply begins after the stone is already in place, as though the terraces were a natural feature of the landscape rather than a human construction. Consider the math. A single granite block in the old bear enclosure at the Zurich Zoo measures nearly 10 feet across and is estimated to weigh over 20 tons. The official record credits a small team of local laborers with cutting, hauling, and setting this block in 1868, using tools no more advanced than iron chisels, wooden sledges, and horse teams. No crane capable of lifting such a mass existed in that city at that time. No contractor's ledger records payment for the specialized equipment such a lift would have required. The block simply appears in the historical record, already seated, already level, already load-bearing. The Dublin Zoo tells a similar story. Beneath the old lion enclosure lies a platform of interlocking limestone segments, fitted so tightly that visitors in the 1880s wrote letters describing how rainwater would vanish into the seams without pooling, as though the stone itself were designed to drain. A landscape architect is credited with the layout, yet nothing in his surviving notebooks describes ordering, shaping, or fitting stone of this scale. His notes discuss plantings, sightlines, and fencing. The platform he supposedly designed is treated in his own writing as something that was simply there for him to build around. This pattern of silence is the real mystery. If the 19th century had genuinely engineered these terraces, we would expect boasting. Victorian society loved nothing more than celebrating its own achievements, publishing engineering society papers, commissioning commemorative plaques, printing lithographs of construction sites for public sale. Every railway bridge, every canal lock, every ironworks got this treatment, and yet the single most technically demanding structural elements in an entire zoological garden, the platforms bearing tens of thousands of tons of dressed stone, generated no celebration at all. Either the builders considered the achievement beneath mention, which is implausible given how proud the era was of lesser feats, or they did not consider themselves the builders at all. The layout of these platforms raises the same questions found across Eurasia's other so-called Tartarian sites. At Budapest, the original zoo boundary was not a simple rectangle or oval, the shape you would expect from a purely functional design. It traced an octagonal perimeter with retaining walls meeting at precise, repeated angles, echoing star fort architecture found in military structures the empire builders of Tartaria are said to have raised across the continent. Aerial surveys taken decades later show that the enclosures within this boundary align to compass points with an accuracy that would have required surveying instruments considered rare luxuries at the time. Instruments a municipal zoo commission would have had little reason to procure for the placement of an antelope paddock. Warsaw offers perhaps the clearest anomaly. Beneath the old aviary, a shallow basin of interlocking stone still channels rainwater along a gentle, almost invisible gradient toward a central drain, without a single modern pump or mechanical assist. Engineers who examined the site during a renovation in the 1980s noted that the gradient was too subtle to have been laid out with period tools, requiring calculations more consistent with formal hydraulic engineering than with the estimation methods available to a local stonemason working from experience alone. The renovation report describes the basin as pre-existing, incorporated into the aviary design rather than built for it. Language strikingly similar to what appears in other cities' internal maintenance records, always describing discovery, never construction. What we are left with is a continent-wide pattern. Different cities, different national governments, different architects working in different decades, and yet the same underlying signature: megalithic platforms of dressed stone, water channels engineered beyond the tools of the era, geometric layouts aligned to cardinal points and to older star fort traditions, and an almost total absence of construction documentation. The official story asks us to believe that dozens of independent municipal projects across the continent all arrived, coincidentally, at nearly identical monumental solutions to the simple problem of housing animals for public viewing. A far simpler explanation is that they did not build these platforms at all. They found them already standing, already leveled, already suited to bearing enormous weight, and they built cages on top because the labor had already been done for them by whoever came before. If this seems difficult to accept, ask why so many of these platforms sit precisely atop older cartographic markings. Survey maps from the mid-18th century, decades before any of these zoos were officially founded, already show star-shaped or octagonal stone compounds at these exact locations, labeled in the sparse, careful language of surveyors, documenting something they themselves did not fully understand. These are not zoo boundaries drawn in anticipation of future construction. They are notations of existing stonework, structures whose origin was already a mystery to the map makers of their own century. The animals chosen for these earliest exhibits deepen the puzzle rather than resolve it. In nearly every case, the founding collections favored species native to the Eurasian steppe and forest belt: wolves, bears, wild horses, birds of prey associated with the plains rather than with any colonial territory. If these platforms were purpose-built modern structures with no older history, there would be no obvious reason for this consistent regional preference. But if the platforms themselves were remnants of a much older Eurasian network, structures original to the very cultures whose animals were later placed upon them, the choice makes a strange kind of sense. The exhibits were not simply displays. They may have been a way of reclaiming a landscape whose original meaning had already been lost, filling ancient stone with living creatures so that no one would think to ask what the stone had held before. What were these platforms actually for, before the first cage was ever built? The water channels suggest something beyond simple runoff management, precise enough to imply purpose rather than convenience. The geometric alignments suggest observation, ritual, or some function tied to the land itself rather than to public entertainment. And the total silence of the historical record, no construction logs, no engineering praise, no quarry orders, no crane rentals, suggests that the 19th century inherited far more than it invented. The stewards of the age of steam may have simply been the last in a long line of custodians, tending structures they did not build and did not fully understand, and passing along a mystery that the concrete and gift shops of the modern zoo have almost, but not quite, managed to bury. Once you accept that these platforms predate the zoos built on top of them, the next question becomes unavoidable. What was their original purpose, if it was never meant to be the display of animals at all? The evidence buried beneath these terraces points towards something far more deliberate than simple foundation work, and it begins, as it so often does in these investigations, with water. At the old Budapest terraces, a network of stone-lined channels still runs beneath the reptile house, carrying moisture away from the enclosure floor along a gradient too subtle to have been achieved by trial and error. When maintenance crews traced these channels during a 2003 renovation, they discovered that the stonework extended far beyond the boundaries of the modern zoo, disappearing beneath a public roadway that had been paved directly over it in the 1930s. No effort was made to follow the channel further. The renovation report simply notes that the extent of the original system could not be determined and recommends sealing the visible sections in concrete, a recommendation that was carried out within the year. No engineer's name appears on that recommendation. No follow-up survey was ever commissioned. The channel simply vanished back into bureaucratic silence, exactly as it had for the century and a half before it was briefly, accidentally rediscovered. This reflex, discover, document briefly, then seal in concrete, appears again and again across these sites. At the Zurich Zoo, workers repairing a drainage issue beneath the old primate house in the 1970s broke through what they described in internal notes as a false floor, revealing a chamber lined with fine, pale sand beneath a ceiling of interlocking stone beams bearing no visible mortar. The chamber was measured, briefly photographed, and then filled with construction debris within 72 hours. No sample of the sand was retained for analysis. No outside experts were consulted. The zoo's own archive lists the incident under general maintenance, with no further reference in any later document. A retired groundskeeper who worked at the site in that era later recalled, in a private interview decades afterward, that the air rising from the chamber before it was sealed felt distinctly cooler than the surrounding soil, and carried what he described only as a faint mineral hum, a detail that never made it into any official report because no one thought to ask him. The acoustic properties of these hidden spaces are perhaps the most difficult detail to dismiss as coincidence. Staff at the Warsaw Zoo have long described a low, steady tone, audible near the old aviary basin on quiet nights, once the daytime noise of visitors and machinery has faded. Zoo management has attributed this to wind moving through the drainage system, yet keepers note that the tone persists on nights with no wind at all, and that certain animals, particularly the large birds of prey housed nearby, grow noticeably still and attentive whenever it occurs, as though responding to something in the stone rather than in the air. A visiting acoustics researcher who recorded the phenomenon in 2015 measured a resonant frequency strikingly close to those documented at other supposedly ancient sites across the continent, a frequency associated in ancient architecture with chambers built for sound amplification rather than simple storage. The researchers' request to conduct a longer, more thorough survey was declined by zoo administration the following spring, with no explanation offered beyond a general note about limited staff availability. None of this fits the profile of an animal enclosure. Whisper galleries, resonant chambers, sand-filled voids sealed beneath megalithic ceilings, precisely graded water channels extending beyond any modern property line. These are the hallmarks of engineered infrastructure, not the incidental byproducts of 19th-century zoo construction. If the original builders of these platforms intended nothing more than to house animals, there would be no reason for this level of hidden complexity beneath the visible surface. The complexity only makes sense if the platforms were never designed around animals at all, if the animals were a later addition placed atop a system whose true function had already been forgotten by the time the first zoo charter was signed. The geographic pattern reinforces this. Plot these sites on a map, and they do not scatter randomly across the continent. They cluster along known geological fault lines, buried river systems, and quartz-rich bedrock formations, precisely the kind of locations modern geologists associate with naturally amplified electromagnetic activity. Budapest sits above a network of underground thermal springs. Zurich straddles a buried glacial channel. Warsaw's old zoo grounds rest on a bedrock shelf known locally for unusual soil resonance during minor seismic activity. These were not sites chosen by 19th-century committees for their scenic value or convenient access to rail lines. They were, it seems, chosen because something about the land itself had already marked them as significant, long before any zoo director ever walked the grounds. This is where the deeper theory takes shape. If an earlier, technologically sophisticated culture, the one described in surviving pre-19th century maps as a vast Eurasian empire, since erased from official history, built these platforms as functional infrastructure rather than architectural ornament, their placement at energy-rich geological nodes would make perfect sense. Water channels engineered with impossible precision, sand chambers filled with uniformly milled quartz, granite ceilings capable of amplifying and concentrating sound, star-shaped and octagonal geometries aligned to cardinal points. All of this reads less like a garden and more like a distributed network, a system built to harness some property of the Earth that we have only begun to rediscover through modern instruments. Quartz, after all, is known to generate a measurable electric charge under mechanical stress, a property modern physics only formally described in the late 19th century. A civilization capable of quarrying, transporting, and precisely fitting stone at the scale we see beneath these platforms could plausibly have understood this property centuries earlier through direct observation, long before it had a name in any textbook. Under this reading, the animals were never the point. They were camouflage, a way of giving ordinary purpose to structures whose true function had already slipped beyond the memory of the people now responsible for maintaining them. A zoo requires no explanation. Visitors do not ask why the elephant enclosure sits on a granite slab instead of packed earth. They do not wonder why a light tap on the floor produces a hollow, resonant echo. The presence of a living creature is enough to end the question before it is even asked. And that may be exactly why these platforms have survived largely intact for so long, hidden not through deliberate secrecy, but through the simple, effective distraction of a caged animal pacing overhead. Consider, too, the choice of species in these founding collections, a detail easy to overlook but difficult to explain away. Wolves, bears, wild horses, birds of prey, animals whose calls and movements would have carried across these stone terraces long before any formal zoological society existed. If the platforms were originally tuned instruments, structures designed to respond to vibration, to sound, to the low-frequency pulse of a large animal's call, then the deliberate stocking of these enclosures with loud, resonant, territorial species takes on a different meaning entirely. Perhaps it was never simple coincidence that the wolves at Warsaw fall silent in unison at the exact moment the underground tone rises, or that keepers at Budapest have noted, generation after generation, that certain birds turn their heads toward the same patch of floor at the same time each evening. These are not proof of anything, but they are the kind of small, repeated, dismissible details that accumulate into a pattern too consistent to be pure chance. What remains unresolved is the disappearance of the physical evidence each time it surfaces. Sand samples lost, photographs confiscated or never taken. Renovation reports that describe a discovery in a single paragraph before moving directly to a decision to backfill or seal. This is not the behavior of institutions actively investigating a mystery. It is the behavior of institutions quietly managing one, treating each accidental discovery as a problem to be resolved rather than a question to be answered. Whether this reflects a coordinated effort to suppress the truth or simply generations of bureaucratic instinct to avoid costly, inconvenient complications, the effect is the same. The platforms remain, the questions remain, and the stone beneath the world's oldest zoos continues to hold its silence. It is worth asking, finally, what it would mean if this theory were true. It would mean that the age of steam, the era we credit with inventing modern engineering, modern hydraulics, modern urban infrastructure, was in fact standing on the shoulders of a predecessor whose name and history have been almost entirely erased from the record. It would mean that beneath the gift shops and the plaques and the carefully worded educational placards, there lies a network of channels, chambers, and resonant stone that once served a purpose far larger than housing a bear or an elephant for a Sunday crowd. And it would mean that every time a renovation crew breaks through a false floor and finds sand where there should be soil, or stone where there should be nothing at all, they are not stumbling upon a curiosity. They are touching the last physical remains of a story that someone, at some point, decided the rest of us were not meant to hear. The stone does not explain itself. It never has. It simply waits, level and silent, beneath the daily routines of keepers and the idle footsteps of visitors, holding its resonant frequency, and its sealed chambers, and its unanswered questions, indifferent to the plaques that tell a simpler story. Perhaps one day another renovation crew will break through another floor, and this time someone will think to ask the right question before the concrete arrives. If you have stood on one of these old zoo terraces yourself, or if your own city's zoo has a history that does not quite add up, tell us about it in the comments. We read every one, and some of the best leads in this investigation have come directly from viewers who notice something the official history left out.